So today we're going to talk about sovereign states versus nations. We are going to be looking at this for the Power and Borders section of the OCR A-level course, and looking at the definitions of what a state is, what a nation is, and the terms of sovereignty and territorial integrity that relates to that. So we're going to look at what makes up the characteristics of a state. We're going to define a state and then see how that is slightly different to a nation. So two of the key ideas in terms of looking at a state are these terms, sovereignty and territory. So when we think about sovereignty, you might think of it in terms of your own classroom. Sovereignty is the idea that there is an authority which rules over that land and people in a territory. So in your classroom, your teacher would be the complete authority. They have control over what goes on in your classroom, but also the people in it. So sovereignty is the same, but on a kind of countrywide level, and it normally involves a government that has authority over the land and the people. Territory is, again, you can think of this in terms of your classroom, it's just the area which they control. So here I've got a picture of Norway, the outlined, and it shows the clear border, and the Norwegian government would rule that entire territory. They would have sovereign control over that territory. So it relates to the area of land that a state can control. So we're now going to look at what makes up the different characteristics of state and then kind of come up with a full definition. So I can see on this outline of Norway that there is a really clearly defined border that marks the edge of the territory. And one of the characteristics of a state is that they actually have a defined territory that is internationally recognised. I've put a picture here of the UN flag. So that means that lots of other countries in the UN would have to recognise the borders and the territory that Norway occupies for it to be a legitimate state. Here we've got a picture of Biden and Kamala Harris, two of probably the most recognisable politicians in the world. And what this here is supposed to represent is that there needs to be a certain level of recognition by other states in terms of that government. So pretty much all of the countries around the world or the other governments would recognise that Biden's government is a legitimate government, and that's recognised by multiple states. Again, this is usually done through UN membership, in the same way that at the moment Boris Johnson is recognised as the head of a single government in the UK. Here's an example of where that doesn't quite fit the pattern. So Kosovo is in some people's opinion, it is a state, but actually there's nearly half of the UN states that don't recognise it as an independent state. They say that Kosovo is actually just a part of Serbia and that it's disputed territory. And they don't necessarily recognise either the territory or the government. So that's why that importance that other countries recognise you is very important. In the map at the top, all the grey areas are the 50 or so UN member states that don't recognise it, while the green ones are the ones that actually do. So we can see quite a lot don't recognise it. Another example of a characteristic of a state that we can see here is that President Obama is meeting with other heads of state. And one thing that a state needs to be able to do, it has to have the capacity to engage in formal relations. So have conversations with other states and engage with them politically to be able to be seen as a legitimate state. Here's a good example of something that's really fundamental to an idea of a state. They have to be able to be independent and self-governing. That means that other states can't really interfere with the running of that state. And we call this idea of the fact that no states can interfere and you have power in relation to other states, we call that external sovereignty. If you've got power within your own country, so the example of the UK government having power within its own government, its own state, we would say that's internal sovereignty. Here's a good example where a state is intervened in another state's business. So Russia has annexed Crimea, which used to be part of Ukraine, so they conflict over who owns it. Russia say it should be part of Russia. Ukraine says it should be part of Ukraine. This is a dispute over territorial integrity. That basically means that it's the area of land a state legitimately controls, and that can't be violated. So Ukraine should have Crimea as part of their state because it was within their borders, that area of land, and it shouldn't be allowed that Russia can get involved. It even says this in the UN article that member states must not force or threaten the territorial integrity of another state. So Russia shouldn't be allowed to intervene in anything that's going on in Ukraine, or even try and change the borders of Ukraine to claim new land. An example we've already talked about here is, and Boris is giving an announcement of the COVID pandemic, and there's a police force there, and it's the idea that they have to be able to maintain sovereignty, so a level of political control throughout its territory. And they do this through the state apparatus. So that basically means the institutions. It could be the police force, the education system, the healthcare, the legal system. And Boris is showing great kind of sovereignty here. He is basically putting people into a lockdown, and basically he's maintaining control over the events that are happening within his country through his sovereign power, and he's using the state apparatus to be able to do that. The last couple of things here, we need a permanent population. It can't be nomadic, it can't move around, and they have to have the right to self-determination. This is basically a term that means that a group of people should be able to determine their political status and pursue their own development. It essentially means that a group of people should be able to vote for who they want to vote for and be able to pursue a level of development which meets their needs. So it's an important aspect to having a state. So therefore, once we add all these things together, we add in the territory, we add in control over people and a single government, we get this definition, which is that there's an area of land of an independent country with very clear boundaries which mark the territory, and that they are people are organised under a single government. We're now going to look at something slightly different, which is a nation, and there's two good examples here of the Maori nation and the Kurdish nation. This is slightly different from a state. The definition of a nation is a group of people that have a shared identity. This is usually done in terms of culture or language or religion. So the Maoris there are doing a cultural dance, which is known as the haka, which you might see before rugby games. But also they will have shared language and traditions. This is slightly different from a state because the ways it's different is the fact is you can have people from a nation living in multiple states. And I'm using the example of the Kurds here. The Kurds live in Iran and Iraq and Syria and Turkey, and therefore they're not all living in one state. They're living across multiple states. They can coexist in a territory. So, for example, you could have two nations living in one state. So the Maoris live in New Zealand, but there's also other nations that live in New Zealand that coexist with them. And the last thing, and probably one of the most important things, is they usually don't have sovereignty over an area. So the Kurds, they would like to have a state, and they're trying to have a state called Kurdistan, but at the moment they don't have sovereign control in Turkey, Syria, Iraq or Iran, and so they are a nation that can be spread out a lot across multiple states, but don't actually usually have power over one area. The only example is that can happen. This is the idea of a nation state in which an entire nation is big enough that it has control over an actual state.